And don't try to pick out
the best looking
sons and daughters.
Yeah, that didn't work out for you.
I didn't. No. Go after whom the Lord draws to you.
Yes.
But I had insatiable desire. Because I was tired of doing church and no results.
Welcome to the Advancement Podcast. This is Taylor Schote with Tim Ware, the president of Advancement Coaching and Consulting. Today, we will be discussing practical insights for pastors and church leaders to advance your life, your work, and your ministry. Are you ready to advance?
Joining us for a special series on spiritual heritage are Dr. Wayne Lee and Dr. Mike Harper.
Well, guys, it's great to be back to hopefully wrap up this conversation on spiritual descendants and parenting. And I know already I have been challenged and informed and encouraged about how to be a better spiritual son and to be a better spiritual father. But Dr. Lee, will you share with us some of your story about the Palm Beaches of Florida?
Well, my journey started where I was trying to train pastors, and I went to the educational institution first, and it didn't provide the environment that I needed. So I thought I had to learn to do church. In my first church, I made good disciples, but followers. But I didn't make sons. I didn't make people that would be able to stand on their own and lead. And so I was determined in this church, the second church, suburban church. I was still writing church life. I was still trying to think through all the concepts of how do we do church. But I realized in the journey, you can't do church without growing people. In fact, growing people has got to occur simultaneously. And that is not something, in a college setting, you give them curriculum and you expect to grow them through curriculum. But when you get live people, you realize curriculum is not going to be enough. You can't transform somebody with knowledge. Mm. In fact, you make people proudful, but you don't transform them. So I had to bring the converts into an environment where I could truly train sons that would get up and do the work of God, and would create a strong church. The church had collapsed. I think in the bottom of it, I had 43 on one Sunday, and then I pulled together in a very aggressive kind of training. I pulled together 7 or 8 guys who were just they had lost their way in life, and I truly started pouring into them. And the end result of the church, and I stayed there 15 years, and it grew to be a mega church. But the end result was I had 50, 55, 60 in full-time ministry. Mm. And so I think the critical piece for us to talk about.
So how many of those would you say were spiritual children also?
Well, I would say all of them were spiritual children. I would say all of them started out. Now, if you stay with them over a period of years, you can do something. I was there through many of them going into their adolescence because I stayed at the church for that long. And so, but then they went into ministry, and I was still pastoring here. And so they're out there. I would help them as they would get through issues. But most of the people that we're talking to are just starting this journey of how do you take sons and daughters and begin to work with them? And I would suggest make good disciples Make good disciples. They will connect to you if you make good disciples. And you can't make it through just knowledge. You've got to go those 4 quadrants for us. You've got to do that, the spiritual encounter. You've got to do the relational commitment. This has to be a relational commitment that you make. Then you have to go into what I call incarnational knowledge, where you are teaching them what Jesus taught you. And then you got to help them be productive. They've got to make a commitment to produce. Jesus said, if you don't bear fruit, I'll cut you off. And so I insisted on sons bearing fruit. Once you start moving with disciples and they take it and they grab a hold of it and they say, I want more, now you have the opportunity of some spiritual sons and daughters. So I think everybody can make disciples and then see if they will become spiritual sons or daughters.
So in the first 4 episodes in this series, we defined what is spiritual heritage. We talked about why it's important in the church currently, being descendants and then being spiritual fathers. And now what we're really moving towards is the question is, this topic is, how do we put this into this idea of spiritual fathers, mothers, spiritual sons and daughters, spiritual descendants into the culture of our church? Right. And what you've just said is it begins with creating disciples, right, not with creating sons and daughters, that those will emerge. So it begins with creating disciples.
It appears that the pattern of the Lord, and it certainly had been the pattern of mine, is that you make disciples first. And if you can get 2 or 3 together, then that becomes a small group. So you are thinking in terms of a disciple, then putting them in a small group, and then out of that, will they stay with you and begin to reproduce?
Now, this is not just, now obviously you're talking about it from a pastoral and recreating ministers, but for a person who's sitting in the congregation, it still means you can gather a group of people and disciple them. The same thing. Yes. It's not just just ministry people.
No. I would say that is the pattern of the New Testament, and it doesn't have anything to do with a licensed minister. And that is, Jesus commanded all of us to make disciples,
right.
And
which is important.
And then gathering them together in a small unit. And so I think you won't know who a son and daughter of yours are until you start giving them the basic claims of Christianity. They begin to respond to it. They eat it up. And they say, I want more. And then you take them with you, as Jesus did. You take them with you to do spiritual things, to do the work of the ministry. And I did not anticipate these 40 or 50 or 60 going into ministry. I was training them for the local church. We were just doing church. I was not anticipating, and they realized, I can do what he's doing. I can do this well. I'm ready for this. And so I was mad at first when they would leave me. I'm thinking, why would I invest my life in you and you leave me? And so I don't think you're going to know who your sons and daughters are until you start those basic processes with them. Now,
so what I heard him say is, I was a young dad and I wasn't happy with my kids.
Absolutely. I don't want them to leave me.
I don't know. I wasn't sure how to be a dad because they made me mad when they left. So putting it into, all right, Mike, you're sitting there, you've got a contemplative look. When you think about putting this into the culture and the DNA of your congregation, what are the thoughts that you're thinking?
It's funny you'd ask me that. I'm just sitting here thinking my story and Taylor Morgan's story is very similar. We went through infertility. We were desperate to have children. We were pastoring a church in a community where everybody was young and everybody who was having babies, and we desperately wanted to have one. And we just really began to pray and say, Lord, you're going to have to intervene, because every specialist had gone to had basically said to us, this is probably not going to happen. And I think there's part of that earnest desire that has to be inside of us to say, Lord, I want a son. I want a daughter. And if you'll give me that, we'll be a good steward of it. So for us, I think a great place to start is to say, Lord, I don't have any around me. Lord, would you give me one? And if you'll give me one, it's that Matthew passage in 24:25. If you'll give me this one, I'll be a good steward of it.
Yeah.
And you'll give me another one, and I'll be a good steward of that one. And so I think for me, it all begins with that earnest desire to have spiritual sons and daughters.
And don't try to pick out
The best looking
sons and daughters.
Yeah, that didn't work out for you.
I didn't. No. Go after whom the Lord draws to you.
Yes.
But I had insatiable desire. Because I was tired of doing church and no results.
Well, I think one of the things that I hear in that is you were doing it. And when we think about the DNA and culture of our church, I know it was going on deeper in that. So when I love what you just said, that piece of desire, the phrase we often use in our context when we're talking is create urgency. Right. That there has to be an urgency in the people. And I would say that when we talk to pastors about creating urgency is that part of this is you got to talk about it. I mean, it should if it's part of what you want in the DNA of church, it should end up in your sermons. It should end up. I mean, these are things you have to talk about and actually do. But there is a part where you have to talk about it if you want to get into the culture of your church. That's the beginning of creating urgency, right?
Yeah, I think the other thing about creating urgency is when people see it modeled and they go, "Ooh, I want that." Tim, there's guys that you and I have talked with who said, "Wow, you and Tim have a relationship." Yeah. I have guys say to me all along, "How is it that you and Doc are so close?" I would kill.
That's right.
I'd kill for that. And so I think there's not only is once you get a son, but then you make a decision to be a good father to that son.
Right.
And make it so attractional that people go, I want it to be the norm. I want what Doc and I have. I wanted that with you. I didn't initially know that I wanted it with you. Right. But once we had that relationship, I wanted other people to say, man, I wish I had that relationship. And so I think there's this desire component. And then once God honors that desire, then you are a good steward of that and make it to such a degree that other people want to replicate that so that they can become the normative. I think it was the norm for Paul.
Exactly right.
I think that's why Paul had so many is because Paul could handle it. And he'd been faithful with one and Timothy and then all the other people. And I think there's that attractional piece there that you have to factor in.
I think what you just said is also very enlightening that as a pastor, because if we're talking to pastors, how do you get this into the DNA of your church? You actually have to steward not just your own, but you have to steward that among your people. There's a stewardship component that we're and when you said it, I realized to myself, if there's anything, people say they want it, and there's some things, but we've heard sermons on it in recent days. But are people stewarding this part of the mission of Christ? Are we stewarding the heritage?
I know that we're talking to ministers, and so I want to say that when I went to the Lord about this problem, I needed leaders. I needed somebody who was going to help me do something. The Lord said to me, "You have not preached on the calling." And I said, "Well, what does that have to do with it?" And he said, "Well, people will give you discretionary time if I call them. And you need discretionary time if you're going to make sons and daughters. And so preach on the calling. I've already called them, but you don't know who I've called." Right. And so I said, okay, I'll preach on it. Almost as a chat, the Lord and I talking, and I'm telling him there's nobody out here that has been called. So I preach on the calling. To my shock, they come to the altar, they're dedicating themselves, and I'm saying, how did I not know this? How could he have called them and I not know this? And so it was that group that I started with. It was that group right there who said to me, I think God has got a call in my life, but I don't know what to do with it. Well, the truth of the matter is they're looking for a father.
Right.
Right.
They're looking for somebody to help them.
Yeah. It's not a son problem. It's a dad problem.
I think so too.
Yeah, it's a father problem.
Taylor's story in the last podcast, in the last episode, was that you've got, if you talk about it, there are people saying, I want sons,
Yeah.
I want fathers, I want mothers, I want daughters, but we have not talked about it. We have not preached about it. Any pastor that's really listens to this whole series, he's got a sermon series we've just given you guys a sermon series here. Listen to all 5 episodes. We've given it to you. I mean, that's truth in that, though.
Yes, you have to talk about it. You have to preach about it. One of the things of preaching about it is that is the way that our guys build the conviction of what's truth. They study it. They grapple with the competing values in that, and I'm telling you that guys will not give you discretionary time unless they think they will benefit from it. They may not say up front, at least in that time, that I want a spiritual father. They didn't say that to me. They said, I don't know what to do with this. That's what they said to me. And I didn't have enough sense to know, okay, I know exactly what to do with this. I was shocked. And so I had to say, okay, what do I do with them? What does that look like? How do I take sons in and train them to be what God has intended for them to be? And so that's the journey, talking about it, dialoguing, preaching it, beginning to move toward that reality.
You've used the phrase discretionary time, and I know you're talking in that ministry component, but it does create the thought in me that from a leadership position in a congregational setting, if I want this to permeate not just our ministers, but the DNA of our church, then I actually have to make room for it in the vision. I have to make room for spiritual vision inside of what we do.
Right.
I have to make room for it. Now, that could look like a lot of things, but it feels like that's really what we're saying. We have to. I don't know, is make room for it or prioritize it. I'm not sure what the right wording is here, but.
Well, you have to make room for it, because if you're going to do anything with them, then you have to set aside time. And so I didn't have any time. As a busy pastor, I didn't have any time. So I set it up with my guys very early in the morning or in transition on the way home. And that's where I started with my journey with them. And so you do have to make it a priority. If you're going to develop people, you have to make it a priority. And so I took it from Jesus. It looked like to me that he mentored and developed his guys in transition. So that's the reason I took it in the transition from work. And I said to their wives, I'll have them home by this time. I'll only keep them for this amount of time, but I want to be with them. And it was priority for them and me. And when I recruited them, I recruited the wife and said, I will send back to you the man you always wanted to have.
All right, so this actually brings up a whole nother thought in this. When we're talking about teaching it, putting in the DNA, you talked about you recruited men, and in today's context, we do need to recognize that fathers father sons, don't father daughters. Don't the mothers with daughters. There's just we have to protect the anointing.
Well, I just feel like I can be stronger. I can be more direct. I can have the sexual thing doesn't come in at all, and so I just have found it better to work with spiritual sons, and let my wife work with the spiritual daughters, or another lady.
Mike, what are you thinking?
I just agree. I just think that it's so needed in our culture, period. Taylor's a prime example of a whole generation that has grown up with a bifurcated family, stepfather who really just was maybe more interested in the mom than the whole brood, And I just think the Scripture says you just don't have many fathers. It never says you don't have a lot of sons. I just think there's a lot of sons out there that are desperately waiting on us to step into a role of leadership and step into an authority that God has given us as leaders to be fathers, to father men, women in the kingdom of God. And I think if we'll step into that role, we'll find an anointing and an authority will follow.
It's not a... I want to make sure that I'm not twisting theology here, but this could bring a whole new level of to the idea of pure and undefiled religion, that piece of engaging orphans, and these are we're talking, there are spiritual orphans among us, and when we view it that way, that's a whole nother layer,
right,
to this idea.
I didn't say that, but that's exactly what I took as my first group. I took people who had been discarded. Partly I took them because I didn't know if it would work.
You didn't know if you were that good, right?
I knew I wasn't that good, but they weren't that good either. So and so we're all right. So I took orphans that had been beat up by life. And I thought, if I can turn this group into spiritual sons, then any group can be turned into spiritual sons. So I took guys who had just been in prison, guys who had just gone through a very bad divorce, orphans that had struggles in life, and they had great need. They had great need, and I had great need in this church. This church had collapsed. I didn't really have that much to lose.
But see, I had great need. When we really connected, you had great need.
I think that's what I was thinking, because we were successful in ministry and we had mentors and people pour in, but it didn't give. But I was still an orphan.
Yeah.
I was an orphan who had found my way, who had gone against the odds, in the natural realm, but had succeeded in spite of. And yet here we are at this side, still in need. So I think maybe that's another piece for the pastor out there who says, how do I put this into the DNA? We say it's create urgency. The first thing is you got to recognize the need, that this is a need in your church.
Right.
This is a need in the kingdom.
right.
It would be interesting how many pastors could have a meeting of people, and how many of them would have results like they had in their church. If you had this gathering and say, okay, let's talk about this. How many people would say, I would love to pass it on or have somebody speak it into me? And it just would be I wish we could do a study on that, because I think it'd be amazing.
Yeah, it's interesting because in all of these episodes, kind of culminating to this moment for me, is how do we put this in our church practically? And I think we wouldn't have told you this on the front end of this of us having that meeting, but now I'm recognizing that it's almost like we recognized that there needs to be fathers in our church, so we went looking for fathers, not just sons. And I'm reminded of what Jesus told to the disciples. He didn't call them. He didn't say, "Come follow me, I'll make you a disciple." He said, "I'm going to make you fishers of men." And I think as a pastor, as a staff pastor, even as a leader in the church, we've got to take a step and go, I'm going to look for sons, but I'm also going to look for sons that can reproduce.
Right. Wow, there you go.
I'm going to look for fathers in the congregation, and it's let's exponentially start reproducing.
Right.
Yes, if our commitment, it seems like to me, and it's very much not in the church today, if I'm going to bring a son in and they can't or won't reproduce, I'm not going to make a spiritual son out of them.
Yeah.
And Jesus was very clear about it. You don't bear fruit, and I cut you off. Now, that is not heard of in the church today, but I'm saying to you privately, I didn't say anything publicly, But I said, if they won't fish for men, I will not develop them.
It's that eternal piece that you talked about
Exactly.
earlier in the episodes, is that this is not just about you, and it's not just about me, but there's a
kingdom.
There's a kingdom inheritance that's got to be passed down.
Yeah. Wow. Well, we're coming to the end of 5 episodes where we have talked about spiritual heritage. And if the cameras had been rolling in between, the dialogue has been so rich. I cannot say thank you enough to you guys for coming. This would not have been anything without y'all. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Thank you for allowing us to do this. It feels uncomfortable because we don't talk about it that much. We just do it.
Yeah.
And so, it felt stronger in education because there was a pathway for that. It felt stronger in the local church because you can see the end result of that. I'm thrilled that you're talking about this, and thank you for allowing us to be a part of this.
So as we wrap this up, in this episode, we talked about how do we put it, some practical pieces, tried to be practical on how to put it into your churches. And we said that you need to begin with creating disciples, and you've got to create urgency, and there's got to be desire, which means you've got to preach on it, you've got to model it, you've got to steward it, and you've got to actually make room for it in your process, which I think is important. I would also say that we have to caution pastors, because the first thing you want to do is put it into a program. Mm-hmm. And the reality is this is relationship based. You can't this is about letting the word of the generation is it needs to be organic. There has to be a certain amount of, the real word is there has to be a divine component to it.
Yeah. It's
that. So let's go. Let's just kind of go around the room in our reflection. We've got a minute or so. Let's start with you. What's your takeaway, not just maybe from this, but maybe from the whole series, either one? What's your big takeaway for being in the room with these guys, with us today?
Well, for me, it feels like a family reunion.
Yeah.
It's a special moment for me being the youngest son in the room. So thanks for letting me be here and for coming. And the biggest takeaway, I think, for me in all of it is just the reality that the divine piece to this, that I think sometimes I get lost, and I have seen others get lost in this idea that I just want to see you be a good you. And so I'm going to help you be a good you. And that scratches the surface, because we'll say in the ministry, in the church world, like, we obviously want you to be all that God's called you to be, but there's a divine piece to it that's more than you.
Yeah.
And that's more than me. And that God really is working this thread, this line, the fruitful line is what, if there's anything today that's stuck with me, it's going to be that we want the line to continually produce, because there's a fruit that's eternal.
Yeah. I would say that we've bounced around and we said it, but there's a divinity. I mean, you can, if you could be in the room, you can sense that divinity, the divine connections and purpose. So for me, Doc, big takeaway from this.
I think the takeaway from me is I've never been in a room where there was 4 generations that were so substantially clear of what's going on. And would to be that I could have done more of this as I went through my ministry. And I hope that generations coming will pick this up and continue. So it was a wonderful aha moment for me.
Wow, great. Mike?
I think for me, the takeaway is just the joy piece. It was an unexpected caveat that kind of came about that, I'd not thought. I mean, I thought about how much I just enjoy being with Doc, and then how much I enjoy being with you. And just an unexpected caveat of the relationships, that there's such a unity and that DNA strain. I can see it and hear it in all of our conversations. And that's just an amazing piece to step back and see that what God has done in us, that he can now do through us to others. And I think I want to be a good son to Doc.
Yeah.
And I do my best to do that. but I want to be a good father. Yeah. And I think if we can balance that and teach other people how to balance that, then the kingdom comes into alignment that there's an exponential growth. Wouldn't we want everyone to have what we have?
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, that's what I'm just sitting here going, man, if you only knew how much we enjoy this piece, that it's not organizational, it's very organic.
Yeah. So question for you pastors, really going to focus back in on this episode, is what are the steps you need to take to begin to put this DNA of alignment, this biblical process and pattern that we talked about in the first episode, into the culture of your congregation? What are those first 3 or 4 steps to move down that road in your church and your congregation? Thank you, guys. I love you guys. So good to have you guys with us.
Thank you for joining us today on the Advancement Podcast. The show notes are available on our website at www.advancement.cc, along with other resources. Again, this is Taylor Schode on behalf of Tim Ware and the entire Advancement team. We want you to remember that you are meant to advance.